So let's move on to the second part of chapter 10, talking about sectionalism. And what we're saying here is that there are tensions between different parts of the country due to two main issues: money issues and slavery. Now, we haven't really spent much time on slavery since we first started talking about it, going back to the Revolutionary War. It doesn't mean that it wasn't an issue. What was happening is a lot of the southern states wanted slavery to continue to be protected, and their economy was based on slavery, and they had needed a large workforce, in their opinion, that they did not want to pay in order to work and make their money. And so that happened, and so there was also money issues that were creating tensions between the northern states and the southern states, where the northern and the coastal states like Massachusetts and New York and Maryland and Pennsylvania, those states were making a lot of money, and it was creating a tension between those states and the southern states who weren't making as much money. And again, this created sectionalism, and as sectionalism gets worse, it really starts to divide the country. And if you're thinking ahead, you're thinking, is this going to kind of lead us towards a civil war? Of course it is. And you guys are intelligent, you guys are smart, you're able to put that together. And so they definitely are, this sectionalism is going to create problems in the long run. Part of the sectionalism came to a head at what we call the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise is like our first major piece of slavery legislation since the Constitution. In 1819, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, meaning there are 22 total states in the Union, and 11 of them were free, where slavery was not protected and slavery did not exist. And then you had 11 slave states where if you did want to have slaves, you were fully allowed to have slaves. However, Missouri is going to apply for statehood as a slave state, and that's going to create a balance or an imbalance in particularly the Senate. And as you're talking about the Senate, remember we have 2 senators per state. And so if you have now, at this stage in the game, you would have 2 more slave state senators, which would allow more slave legislation to be passed. And free states weren't too fond of that idea. The Southerners were happy about this, as it would put the balance of power in the Senate towards a slave state. They thought it was going to be great. Now, as far as in the House, this would also put a balance for the slave states in the House, because that would give them one more state that has mainly slave House of Representative members in there as well. And so the Southerners were pretty pumped about this idea. The Northerners, not so much. If you were a person who really did not want slavery, you were a little disappointed in this. So James Talmadge proposed an amendment. And James Talmadge is actually from New York, so this would have been one of the free states. And as he proposes this Talmadge amendment, he said this: slaveholders are prohibited from bringing new slaves into Missouri. They're not allowed to bring any new slaves into Missouri. That was the whole idea. They cannot bring new slaves into the Missouri area. Enslaved children born in Missouri would be free by age 25. We call that emancipated. I'm sure you guys have heard of the Emancipation Proclamation. That's where they get that word. And enslaved children born in Missouri would be free. Now, if you're thinking ahead on this, long term, what is he trying to do? He's basically trying to get slavery to not exist in Missouri. It could exist where it starts, but you can't bring new slaves into Missouri. If they're already there, they can last. And if they're enslaved children, then they would be free by age 25. This proposal was voted down in the Senate. People did not like James Talmadge's proposal because they did not feel like it was just and fair to the southern states. So they scrapped his Talmadge amendment. They scrapped his Talmadge proposal. So, still trying to struggle, what are we going to do with Missouri? Is Missouri going to be able to be considered a slave state or a free state, or how is it going to be admitted? Maybe you should just let the voters in the state decide. But if most of those people there are slave owners, then they're going to want to protect slavery. So, we move on and talk about number 5, if this will shift over here. There we go. Speaker of the House Henry Clay was able to solve the Missouri issue. Now, Henry Clay is also known as the Great Compromiser. Did a lot of great things in our American history to compromise things, and this is one of them. So here's the tenets of the actual Missouri Compromise. He proposed that Maine would be admitted as a free state. That way you could basically balance the two, and Maine would officially be voted in as a free state. Now you guys might be like, I thought Maine was already a state. Not yet. Maine had not really been messed with yet. We had Vermont, New Hampshire up there, but nothing with Maine. So Maine would be admitted as a free state. Missouri would be admitted as a slave state. That way you would keep the balance of power in the Senate, and you'd also, in theory, keep a balance of somewhat power in the House of Representatives, which again, the number of House of Representatives is based on how many people you have in your state. In the rest of the Louisiana Territory, slavery would not be permitted north of the 3630 line, which is basically, if you guys know like globes, they have grids, and this grid would basically be at the southern base of Missouri. And if you want to look in your books on page 184, you can see that in just a second. I'll put up the map. But in the rest of the Louisiana Territory, slavery would not be permitted north of the 3630 line. This was passed and temporarily solved some issues, but created more tensions long term. So the long-term ramifications of this, it kind of like put a Band-Aid on something that was a pretty big wound. It doesn't solve the slavery issue. It allows the slavery to continue on and keep going. But this was passed and temporarily, like I said, solved some issues, but created more tension long term, just because every time a new state wants to come into the Union, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have to admit a slave state along with a free state at the same time. And there's just basically no way around that. And that's what they're struggling with. So let me show you a picture of this map and what this would look like. So the Missouri Compromise would look something like this. And if you notice, you've got your green, which would be your free states, and then you've got your pink, which would be slave states. Missouri, this would be considered a slave state. Here's your Maine, would be considered a free state. And then 3630 Compromise line, this line right here, anything north of this would not be open to slavery. No slavery. Now, the question was, does that line go all the way across here? Well, that's what they were struggling with. They basically said this isn't ours, so it doesn't really matter. And this isn't ours, so it doesn't really matter. So, but what they're doing is protecting all of this to have no slavery. From here down, this could be slavery, the Arkansas Territory. So this map is going to dictate that you are able to, this map's kind of dictating what you're able to see here, and that is simply that slavery is going to be dividing the country. This is why we said sectionalism was becoming a very big deal in our country, because you can see slave, non-slave, and then this will eventually be non-slave, and this will eventually be slave. We are going to talk about this area of the country soon as we get into like the Mexican War and that type of stuff, and then the Oregon dispute in the 1840s. So this is the Missouri Compromise. This pretty much decided what we were going to do moving forward when it came to admitting states. Political changes. One of the big political changes that we had was universal white male suffrage. You guys might be like, wait a second, does that mean that all males are suffering and they're horrible and they're just going to be miserable? No, no, no. The word suffrage actually means the ability to vote. So when people talk about women's suffrage, African American suffrage, what that means is they have the right to vote. Seems like a weird word to be used and people would probably get it confused, but you get the idea. Suffrage means the ability to vote. And moving forward, you no longer have to be a property owner to actually vote. And so you no longer have to own property, which was a huge qualification back then in order to vote. Because if you own property, you had wealth. And now what they're saying is that you do not have to be a property owner at all to vote and be able to vote for the president, vote for other legislative individuals. So that was a big deal. Now, keep this in mind, we're only talking about white males. African American males, white women, African American women still did not have the right to vote. But this did allow more Americans to have a say in the elections, but it's still going to be a while before we get more and more Americans that are actually going to be able to vote in these elections. The wealthy class still ruled most of the political realm, though. And so that was a tough thing because that didn't seem too much distant than what was going on in England, where the wealthy class, if you were smart, if you had money, then you probably got a chance at having your voice heard more than the common person. And we're going to talk about caucuses in just a little bit, but that definitely created a tension between people. And then we had the emergence of a strong two-party system. The Democrat Republicans had dominated since Jefferson. We've talked about that party before. But with the emergence of Jackson, the party had a bitter split. And moving forward, we're going to have two solid American parties that are constantly going to be going at each other. And the election of 1824 kind of becomes the last election where everybody's from the same party and everyone's on the same page, and we're going to have a strong two-party system. And eventually it'll develop into what we're used to today, the Democrats and the Republicans. All right, that's it for this video. We're going to stop here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the caucus and the corrupt bargain another time. Enjoy your afternoon.